of study. He has published numerous books, articles, and chapters on these topics. His first book, Gothic Utterance, explored the sound, poetics, and politics of the voice in Gothic fiction. He is currently completing a short monograph on Gothic coast for CUP's Elements in the Gothic series with Laurence Publicover from Bristol. A literary history of the seabed for the University of Chicago Press with Emily Alder and Joan Passey. An edited collection on coastal Gothic. Other publications have explored the literature of Wales and Whalers, littoral, ecogothic, the haunted Midlands and its eerie canals, and folk horror and war. So thanks again for joining us today, Jimmy, and over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, as that brief précis of my sort of unfocused research interests might suggest, is that, as I suspect will also become quite apparent as we go today, this focus on love and the Gothic is something I'm really just beginning to think about, beginning to get to grips with. So the stuff that I'd like to suggest that we sort of talk about today, I suppose, is tentative, speculative thoughts rather than anything approaching a kind of finalized conclusion. For those of you I have bored already with this material, I spot a few familiar names in the people here. You may recognize some of this material as well, and may notice that my thinking on this hasn't advanced significantly since you last heard me rambling about it 6 months ago, or whenever it might have been. But first, let me share my screen. So hopefully people have a nice PowerPoint to look at, rather than me. So yeah, as I say, as some of you may know, I've been kind of gravitating towards an interest in the place of love in the Gothic for a little while now, just picking up little bits and pieces to sort of chew over here and there. This has proceeded largely from my seminar teaching, so it's really nice to have former students in attendance here. And based mostly on a dawning realization that what I'm seeing in our Gothic literature each week, and all that I'm talking about, perhaps all that I want to be talking about, is love. Partly this has stemmed from a form of self-preservation. If our students, if we perhaps as researchers naturally gravitate towards the grimmer and less salubrious aspects of the Gothic in our discussions, in our essays, as a tutor, a kind of confrontation with this year on year with all of the misery can be perhaps slightly draining. So I've been trying to celebrate the place of love in the Gothic as a kind of resistance to the horror. But it has also stemmed from the simple fact that love, declarations of love in particular, are everywhere in the genre. And this is where I might then produce a short list of examples. But it is everywhere, from here to here. But I don't need to produce that list, I think, because you will all have your own examples of this popping to your mind. To be a bit more precise about where I'm coming from, I'm particularly interested in love as an intense feeling or emotion, love as a kind of ecstatic affect within Gothic. And so I've become increasingly interested in the Gothic tradition less as the literature of terror, to revisit David Punter's classic formulation, but as the literature of ecstasy. I do think love is an absolutely fundamental element of Gothic, not just Gothic narratives, but perhaps also I want to say that love is a kind of catalytic factor in the development of Gothic events, moments of Gothic excess and derangement. But for all this, it is, to the best of my knowledge at least, surprisingly difficult to find scholarship that really digs into the place of love in the Gothic. Andy Smith's article, one of the pieces of reading I put up on Gothica's blog for you, is one of the few notable exceptions to this, I think. But he too made this point 20 years ago about the relative sparsity of scholarship on love. Flick through something like the Encyclopedia of the Gothic, and you will find plenty of material on feelings like terror, on repression, on fear, on dreams, but there's no entry for love, or romance even, in the sense of romantic feelings, or weirdly even desire. And if this feels a little unaccountable, perhaps it is because it is so hard to talk about love. But then my sort of qualifying point to that would be, is it any harder to talk about than talking about fear or terror? So broadly speaking, I am interested in moments of rapture, of jubilant euphoria, where love is something effectively overwhelming and disorienting. I am especially interested when characters try to speak about this feeling. What happens when we try to put the feeling of love, the feeling of something we might call Gothic ecstasy, into words? My first book, Gothic Utterance, was a study of voices of the undead in US Gothic literature, of moments where the dead speak to us, and what it might portend if we, as it were, sit down and listen and even engage those horrifying, unsettling, eerie voices. This very nascent project on the voice of love in the Gothic might then be a kind of positive counterpart to that. And here are some of the texts that I've been sort of initially drawn to, texts around which some of my thinking has been orbiting. I'm not sure yet whether this is something that's going to be totally invested solely in the Gothic tradition, or rather in something that we might call Gothic love or Gothic ecstasy as a mode of expression that could appear in a whole range of texts, purely Gothic or otherwise. I suppose one of the authors who ought to be on this screen who isn't would be someone like D.H. Laurence, who I think fits that bill. And so for this reason, the reason that the Gothic might be a kind of affect or mode within other narratives of love, for that reason is partly why I thought Mary Wilkins Freeman's story The Parrot might be a good thing to read for today. I love that story. It's one of my favourites, and Freeman, I think, is generally a wonderful writer of ghost stories, but her parrot isn't quite fledged as a purely Gothic figure. So what I'd like to do now in my remaining time, if I may, is just talking about love with reference to some texts I find especially appealing. And let's begin here. Right at the end of Sheridan Le Fanu's unavoidable tale of excessive love, Carmilla. During the expository final chapters of this short book, we are provided with this mercenary masculinist category explanation of the vampire mediated by various of the book's patriarchal vampire hunters. It's an explanation that pushes back against, but cannot quite shut down entirely, the irrepressible queer love that radiates from both Carmilla and Laura. The explanation, as I'm sure we all know, this is burned into our psyches. It tells us that the amphibious existence of the vampire is sustained by daily renewed slumber in the grave. Its horrible lust for living blood supplies the vigor of its waking existence. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence, resembling the passion of love by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stratagem, for access to a particular object may be obstructed in 100 ways. It will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will, in these cases, husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. In ordinary ones, it goes direct to its object, overpowers with violence, and strangles and exhausts, often at a single feast. If this were a different talk, I would probably latch on to that idea that the vampire is amphibious. But I am not in a blue humanities mode today. What is the relationship between love and the vampire here? Instead of rehearsing the line about monstrosity and sexuality, or about the vampire as a figure for intense and transgressive desire, I am interested in the uncertainties rather than the vehement certainties that cut through this account of the love-struck vampire. These are uncertainties that, as Lin Young has also recently highlighted, imply an ambivalent worry that the system of categorization that we hear coming through in that passage has failed, and that Carmilla's motivations were less sinister and more tragic than the ordinary vampire case might imply. The vampire, we are told, is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence resembling the passion of love by particular persons. So resembling the passion of love. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. Are these hedged contingencies a plain effort to keep the vampire at arm's length? It is like these things, but it is not these things. The text darts at the vampire via simile in order to maintain that their inner world is not the same as the inner world of the Enlightenment human subject. It looks like love, but it isn't love. But is there another way to spin this? Do these words also speak of the difficulty of imagining that our emotional world is shared by others, of intuiting the feelings of others? You love your partners, but does your partner love you? It certainly looks like they do. It resembles the passion of love, a plausible approximation. To consider further the difficulties that the text exhibits in putting love into words, we might think directly about what Laura calls the wild speech of Carmilla herself, particularly as it appears in chapter 5. So Carmilla, as we all know, is so patently a love story, so obviously a story about the passion these girls seem to feel for one another, that we need to remind ourselves not to overlook the intense strangeness of the ways in which Carmilla and Laura speak about their feelings for each other. How romantic you are, Carmilla, says Laura. Whenever you tell me your story, it will be made up chiefly of some one great romance. She kissed me silently. I am sure, Carmilla, you have been in love, that there is at this moment an affair of the heart going on. I have been in love with no one, and never shall, she whispered, unless it should be with you. How beautiful she looked in the moonlight. Shy and strange was the look with which she quickly hid her face in my neck and hair, with tumultuous sighs that seemed almost to sob, and pressed in mine a hand that trembled. Her soft cheek was glowing against mine. Darling, darling, she murmured, I live in you, and you would die for me. I love you so. I started from her. So the context for this passage is that this continuing sense of frustration from Laura that Carmilla will not tell her more about herself, will not give over her history, her sense of who she is to Laura, who asks again and again, who are you, Camilla? Where are you from? So on the one hand, Carmilla's silent kiss stands for that which might be unspeakable, for the unspeakable, unspoken history that Carmilla will not reveal to Laura. That is, Carmilla reaches out to Laura with this gesture of affection, love, friendship, intimacy, however you might read it, at the very moment Laura is hoping Carmilla might make good on their intimacy and friendship and actually reveal something of herself. Instead, Carmilla offers affection that is also a closing off and shutting down of the question of her past. And then in this final remark as well, how easily might we miss the strange inversion or the monstrous assumption that Carmilla makes when she says to Laura, I live in you and you would die for me. I love you so. Surely this isn't right. You would die for me. Carmilla loves Laura so much that Laura would die for this love that emanates towards, not from her. Because, Carmilla seems to imply, Carmilla has taken possession of Laura's body, her being. I live in you, says Carmilla, as if she is not an objective part of the material world, but has been internalized into the very core of Laura's being, and thus that Carmilla's thoughts and feelings are Laura's thoughts and feelings, and vice versa. The slippery state of individuality, the porousness of our being, the colonization of the self by the other. Remarkably Gothic moment indeed. In order to interrogate these ideas in a bit more depth, I want to turn very briefly to a short interview with the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who has been asked to speak briefly himself about love. This is where I try and play a video on the PowerPoint and everything goes terribly wrong. The audio isn't terribly important here as it's all subtitled. Anyway, the interview proceeds for the most part in French.
Just whatever you want to say, ce que vous désirez dire de l'amour. Ça, c'est le topic. L'amour.
L'amour ou l'amour?
Non, l'amour. Pas l'amour. On a suffisant de l'amour.
L'amour. Il n'y a rien à dire. Rien. À moins que vous me posiez une question. Je veux pas traiter la question de l'amour. Non, il faut que vous posiez une question. Je ne suis pas capable d'improviser des généralités sur l'amour, comme ça. Je ne suis pas capable. Peut-être que c'est ça que vous voulez, que je dise que devant votre public que je n'ai rien à dire de l'amour en général.
Ok. Pouvez-vous expliquer pourquoi c'est un sujet qui concerne les philosophes depuis des siècles? C'est un important sujet philosophique, n'est-ce pas?
Je suis pas. Non, il faut pas me demander ça. Pourquoi les philosophes ont parlé de l'amour? Ça a commencé comme ça, la philosophie. Non, non, c'est pas possible ça. J'ai la tête vide. Sur l'amour en général, j'ai la tête vide. Ou sur la raison pour laquelle la philosophie parle beaucoup d'amour, ou bien j'ai la tête vide, ou bien me reviennent des clichés.
C'est un sujet auquel Platon s'est beaucoup intéressé. Peut-être pouvez-vous en parler?
Alors, une première question qu'on pourrait poser, là je dévie un peu, c'est la question de la différence entre qui et quoi. Who and what. Est-ce que l'amour est l'amour de quelqu'un ou l'amour de quelque chose? Alors, supposons que j'aime quelqu'un. Est-ce que j'aime quelqu'un pour la singularité absolue, ce que quelqu'un est? J'aime toi, parce que tu es toi, ou bien est-ce que j'aime tes qualités, ta beauté, ton intelligence, bon. Est-ce qu'on aime quelqu'un ou est-ce qu'on aime quelque chose en quelqu'un? La différence entre qui et quoi, au cœur de l'amour, je dirais, au cœur de l'amour, partage le cœur. Est-ce que le mouvement de mon... On dit souvent l'amour est un mouvement du cœur. Est-ce que le mouvement de mon cœur...
That's probably quite enough of him. I don't really care what Derrida has to say about love so much as finding it intensely interesting, enjoyable, even watching him talk about how he won't talk about it. It's an incredibly baffling and slightly awkward interview. But at the same time, it's a real delight as this interviewer's frustration increases as she just hopes that Derrida will answer the fucking question. Talk to me about love. So where might we begin with this? How about Derrida's confusion? What is being asked of him? Is he being asked to speak about l'amour or l'amour, about love or about death, l'amour or l'amour? Maybe the interviewer doesn't enunciate her words clearly enough, or maybe Derrida is being deliberately obtuse. Either way, the neat phonic resonance, the slippage between love and death is surely something we might imagine as being the exact stumbling block for the Gothic. Is it love I'm encountering, or is it death? How do I know? What is the difference? We've heard enough about death, the interviewer says. And she's not in Gothica. But maybe for all of us as Gothic researchers, she is quite right. We have heard enough about death. But when the interviewer clarifies that she wants him to speak about love, we find the famously loquacious and difficult theorist without much of any real substance to say. She asks him to offer whatever he wants to say about love. This is a strange imperative, something seemingly presupposing that he, indeed all and any of us, have something we want to say about love, as if love might be something we're waiting to speak about. We just need the appropriate prompt, a little nudge in the right direction. As he gets going, as he warms up, Derrida disavows the idea that he has something to say about the question of love. He cannot, he says, speak about love in general, nor can he account for the fascination love has apparently held for philosophers since antiquity. You cannot ask this of me, Amy, he says, rather wonderfully. He goes on ultimately to offer some thoughts that may well be of use to us. What is it we love? Do we love a person, something in the singularity of their being, or do we love an aspect of that person, some quality or characteristic of them? What ultimately are we loving? What do we love? What do we fall in love with? Someone or something? Questions of desire begin to arise here too. And we get a remark a little later in this interview where Derrida says that love is always inflected by disappointment. Love, he says, is disappointed and dies when one comes to realize the other person doesn't merit our love. The point he's raising there, I think, isn't about the failure of someone to earn our love, but rather to do with a realization that the person isn't in the end, in reality, quite like we had in our love imagined them to be. What is being loved here does not necessarily reside outside of one's own being, but rather it is what one imagines someone or something to be like that provides the troubled groundwork on which love might be said to be founded. They do not merit our love, this person, because they were not what we imagined them to be. One might be tempted to speculate here whether love is far too precious a thing to give away, certainly to give away to a singular object of desire. But perhaps we are straying quite far from the Gothic now. Or maybe all of these questions about the spectral nature of the positive emotion or sensation that is love, all of these questions about the complexities of abstracting the who from the what, of not quite knowing where someone ends and some quality of them begins, maybe all of this is to root us quite firmly in the concerns of Gothic fiction. To return, as we might do, yes, to Le Fanu, we might use Carmilla to trouble some of Derrida's philosophizing. Derrida emphasized the singularity of the loved person's being. Do we love that person's singularity? In the singularity of their being, he asks. Carmilla seems to suggest that love itself has dissolved the prospect of singular being. Laura and Carmilla are weirdly, hauntingly merged in this declaration of intense passion. Indeed, if Carmilla's own form seems to shapeshift in this novel, so too do we seem to see that Laura and Carmilla have always been strangely involved with one another, that Carmilla has always dwelt in the recesses of Laura's subconscious, appearing, for example, in her childhood dreams, and vice versa. Where does Laura end and Carmilla begin? Is this a love felt between two beings, or is there something much more selfish here? How far are Laura and Carmilla doubles of one another? And what are the implications of our falling in love with a strange version of our own self? This all begins to suggest that we might not unreasonably think of love as a kind of derangement, a destabilizing of the faculties, a troubling of our sense of self, a troubling of the agency we might formerly have felt belonged to us, that was ours, that was part of us. If this is something that I think Carmilla begins to suggest, it is something I think we see even more acutely in Mary Wilkins Freeman's The Parrot, an author known for her regionalist tales of New England, many of which are ghost stories. We should perhaps not be surprised that a surprisingly articulate bird might provide a good perspective on the Gothic and its uncanny utterances on love. Poe's Raven, after all, does just that, and Freeman's tale can be read productively, I think, as a kind of companion piece to Poe and the Raven. The Parrot is a story about a woman named Martha, straining to live a life of upstanding, even repressive moral and spiritual rectitude, mindful of how one day her inner and outer life might be judged. Complicating this, though, is her passion for secular beauty and what the story calls her rampant force of individuality, which is also externalized in the form of her beloved parrot, a creature with whom she seems utterly besotted. The parrot utters wild, ecstatic things that Martha herself, she admits, could never give voice to. It is this tropical thing, screaming and laughing and shrieking out dissonant words and oftentimes speeches with a seemingly diabolical comprehension of the situation. This parrot was the one note of utter freedom and irresponsibility in her life. She adored him, but always with a sense of guilt upon her. Often she said to herself that some judgment would come upon her for so loving such a bird. The plot of the story concerns Martha's hopes that the local minister will marry her. When he begins to show her affection, she gets her hope up. But sadly, it's not to be. One day he brings over to her house his new bride. Maintaining her equipoise in the face of this heartbreak, the parrot expresses what she doesn't. It lunges at the bride, tears the bride's bonnet, and harries her out of the house. What's really compelling about this story, though, is its characterization of the parrot's voice and its effective power over Martha. The story, as I said earlier, is not classically Gothic, but I do think the story approaches the overwrought excesses of the Gothic's tone in these unhinged moments where we are called to hear the parrot's profane shrieks and cries of uncanny sympathy and pain and tenderness, as the text puts it, outside the pale of humanity. The parrot, that is a kind of Gothic eruption at the heart of a more staid regionalist tale. It is striking, I think, and I hope some people felt this too if you had a chance to read this story. It is striking how the story's descriptions of normative love matching between Martha and the minister read as utterly dry and prosaic compared with the frenzied descriptions of Martha's infatuation with her parrot, and possibly the parrot's infatuation with Martha. Though this is a very different sort of story from Carmilla, I nonetheless think it bears comparison because of its delirious vision of the queer enrapturement that love can, perhaps ought, to stimulate. Here we have Martha thinking about what happens when she speaks with her parrot. When she talked to him with that language of love which every soul knows by instinct, and which is intelligible to all who are not deadened and deafened with self, he would cock his glittering head and look at her with that inscrutable dual eye of his, and thrust out a claw toward her, with that insistence which was ruthless, and yet not more ruthless than the insistence of love, and often say something which confounded her with its apparent wisdom of sequence, and then the doubt and the conviction which at once tormented and enraptured her would seize upon her. Like Carmilla, there is a dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, between human and that which is not human. Where Carmilla speaks on behalf of Laura, the parrot speaks for Martha. The story invites us to relinquish a sense of self by which we may be deadened and deafened, as the story puts it, in order to be more alive to the sound of the language of love. There is something vehement or even violent about this passion. It is ruthless, as this passage says. It seems also, this language, to some degree pre-symbolic, pre-linguistic perhaps. It's a language which every soul knows by instinct, a kind of non or pre-rational figure of speech. What is perhaps most striking about the story as a whole is the fact of the strange commingling of animal voices with human voices, that it stages its love plot through communion between the human and the non-human. This strange coming together of animal voices with a thematic preoccupation on love and what love might do to us, to ourself, to the integrity of our being, is a really important aspect of Freeman's parrot. It is also the overarching concern of the final text that I want to glance towards. The 1942 horror film Cat People, produced by Val Luton. This is a film that I'm tremendously fond of, and I think probably as a result, I'm incapable of speaking about in any objective sort of way. I think it's absolutely brilliant and wonderful, and I would watch it on a loop, I expect, if I were given the chance. The film follows a woman named Irina, who over the course of the film seems to fall in love with and marry the eminently forgettable all-American protagonist called Oliver Reed, who is nowhere near as compelling and unhinged as his later namesake. Irina, however, can't be intimate with Oliver because of a fear she has, gradually revealed over the film, inherited, she believes, through her Serbian heritage, that if she becomes aroused, she will transform into a panther and tear her lover to pieces. No bad thing, perhaps, when it comes to Oliver. Anyway, Oliver fairly swiftly realizes that Irina is far too interesting for him and decides to fall in love with his reassuringly normal co-worker, Alice, whom Irina has spent several nights tormenting. The film wraps up, but not before Irina has indeed, or so it seems, turned into a cat and murdered her lecherous Freudian psychoanalyst, Dr. Judd. And surprisingly too, Irina dies before the credits roll. What interests me for the moment is Irina's relationship with the sounds of the animals that live in the zoo near to her apartment, especially the screams of the panther, and the way that these sounds shadow her relationship with Oliver. The sounds of big cats permeate the film's soundscape, a sort of unsettling background hum to the psychodrama being played out between the human characters. Like Martha in The Parrot, but possibly on a more literal level, Irina collapses the difference and distance between herself and the non-human animals, especially the panther and the lions of the zoo. When partway through the film, Oliver finally musters up the courage to tell Irina that he loves Alice and wants a divorce because, he says, it's better this way, Irina asks, better? Better for whom? Speak, she says to him. You can't speak. There's nothing you can say. There's only silence. But I love silence. I love loneliness. And then, nearly inaudible on the soundtrack, she turns away from Oliver and whispers, in me. They are in me. Their strength, oh, their softness, their softness. Oliver very sympathetically tells her that she's talking like an insane woman. But as we've seen throughout the film, for someone like Oliver, love is a kind of formulaic process, something fairly mobile that might attach itself readily to the nearest breathing human. As he tells Irina when he's irked at her for not being more intimate, when people in America know each other as well as we do, when they're in love or even think they're in love, they've usually kissed long ago. This is his version of what love is. And there's obviously a good deal of truth in this, I think. But the point is that Irina is not playing by the rules. For Irina, love is something far more profoundly unsettling. While the film shows some preoccupation, though in distinctly ambivalent terms, with the idea of hysterical womanhood and indulges in some tremendously overwrought Freudian psychobabble, and offers a vision of the animal passion of love that is perhaps quite on the nose, the film is also, I think, offering a compelling examination of what it might mean for someone to fall in love. Someone, specifically, who isn't as deadened and deafened by self as Oliver is, to recall those words from The Parrot. But instead for someone for whom love is literally transformative. Perhaps a slightly less one-sided way to put this is to say that the film explores the irreconcilability of two radically different visions of what love is, what it means to be in love. Irina's Gothic love on the one hand, and Alice's and Oliver's vision of contented American domesticity. These versions of love exist in different linguistic registers, and Oliver, Alice, and to some degree, Dr. Judd, her therapist, cannot comprehend Irina's language. They cannot match her words and the disorderly sense of self that they speak of to their understanding of love. Okay, I'm conscious of time and boring on at you for any longer, so I'm going to wrap things up there. But yes, thank you for listening. As I say, these are all extremely early thoughts about the role of love, speaking about love, particularly in the Gothic. And I'm not sure yet how far this project might go, whether or not it has legs. But I hope, at the very least, if you haven't already read The Parrot or seen Cat People, it might inspire you to do so. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. We've got lots of virtual clapping going on.